Throughout history, humans have always had one thing in common. We always want to kill each other. I'm Brandon, and welcome to Theaters of War. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Theaters of War. I'm your host today, Brandon, and today we will be discussing aerial warfare. Airplanes, balloons, kites, jets, all of the above. So, the history of air warfare is a lot shorter than Army or Navy, whereas armies had thousands of years to perfect its craft, crafting different weapons, vehicles, armors, tactics, and Navy developing bigger and greater and more powerful ships. The Air Force is a very, very recent addition to the theaters of war that we've been talking about. Although when you think of aerial warfare, you think of planes, jets, that sort of thing, aerial warfare actually started a lot more humbly. Many, many, many years ago in ancient China, we had flying kites that would be used. These kites were used for military intelligence and for communication. There's not much information on the kites, but then we move on to the balloon, which is really when aerial warfare truly came into its own. Balloon warfare was starting to be used in China around the 2nd and the 3rd century. A prototype hot air balloon, and I hope I'm saying this right, the Kunming lantern, was invented for communication purposes. There were some minor balloon warfare in Europe. The first real major instance was a little battle in the Alps, the Battle of Flores. I hope I'm saying that right. My German isn't exactly on point. In 1794, balloons would continue to be used on and off for quite some time, until we get to the American Civil War. Now, this is truly when balloons became much more prevalent. Both the Union and the Confederacy used balloons. However, the Union side, they would use them quite often to bomb, for surveillance, for redeploying troops, pretty much anything you can imagine. They utilized it to the best of their ability. We had some of that in Europe with the Austrians. They would drop some bombs, they would make some balloons, but it wasn't quite as integral as America. America really became sort of the launch pad of a lot of the aerial warfare, which another prime example, of course, entering the 19th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, we saw great advancements in air technology. Of course, we have the Wright brothers. They made their maiden voyage just a year before the Great War. And there were many conventions, one in 1899 and another in 1907, called the Hague Convention, which essentially laid out the rules of aerial warfare. Don't bomb people, don't use it to attack civilians, so on and so forth. The first gun was shot from a plane in 1910, and the first use of planes in actual declared war was in 1911 during the Italo-Turkish War and during the First Balkan War in 1912. This leads us directly into the Great War, which, of course, as many people know, is the infancy of the modern aerial warfare. At first, generals were a bit skeptical. They weren't exactly convinced that airplanes would be the new third theater that they're looking for. Many of them scoffed at it and didn't pay it much mind. But a certain country in Central Europe, a German empire, would utilize not airplanes quite yet, but giant zeppelins. And they would use this to attack Britain on the home front. They would bomb London. They would act as a scary, mystical force flying far above the London sky. Anti-air weapons would do nothing. It would be almost this impenetrable force. Now, you think of World War II, you think of the British going into the air raid shelters and the subway tunnels and all of that. But It actually started in World War I with the Zeppelin raids, communities coming together, hiding underground, and trying to stay safe. Now, Zeppelins were around for a bit, and some balloons were used, especially by the Italians and the Austrians, but the true plane that really solidified modern aerial warfare was the plane you're seeing right now, the Fokker, F-O-K-K-E-R. Developed by Anthony Fokker in 1915, he was a Dutch engineer who invented the first successful gun synchronizer with an airplane. In doing so, you would actually be able to synchronize the bullets with the propeller. And so the propeller would fly and the bullets would fly through the propeller, allowing the propellers to have a much, much longer survivability as bullets weren't constantly hitting it. And it allowed for greater mobility because the guns did not have to be directly in front of the pilot's vision. Now, before this, in 1914, planes were extremely lacking in technology. They could barely get off the ground, and as I said, the generals didn't know what to do. But at this point, 1915, planes truly came into their own. They were used not only on their own in the air, but they actually coordinated with land and naval combat in order to have a synchronized battle. The Allies developed their own synchronized guns, and thus the term dogfighting was invented. This became the lasting and most notable trait of air warfare, and soon bombers, which would be developed later during the war, would be used for strategic bombing to attack munition plants, cities, that sort of thing. Now we move to the interwar period. Now this is an interesting time. The developments weren't quite as advanced or as speedy as World War I, given that we went from essentially barely being able to lift off the sky to having air warfare being an integral and greatly valued part of the military. We move into some slow developments. We had some developments during the Spanish Civil War, which is truly where the kind of first taste of World War II would begin. The Germans fighting the Soviet Union and Italians getting into the Air Force and all of that. This interwar period would be the development of the first ever actual air the air doctrines and the air, detached from the Army and the Navy. The name slips me. The first air regiments and the first air forces, I should say. The first Air Force, the Royal Air Force by the United Kingdom, was invented or created and established in 1917. And after that, in the interwar period, it exploded. The French had an Air Force, the Italians, the Austrians, the Germans, the Russians, Japanese, anyone you can think of, even countries that didn't have particularly large air forces would still establish their own governing forces to run those air forces. And of course, we head into World War II, where we have strategic bombing being the norm. We have the Battle of Britain, one of the most integral and important air battles in history, where Britain had to fight off waves of the Luftwaffe just to survive. We have military transports being used on a large scale in order to move troops from point A to point B much faster than any boat or truck. We have naval aviation exploding with Japan and the United States, as Tyler mentioned last episode, with the aircraft carrier, the kamikaze pilots, where planes would be directly used in collaboration with the Navy in order to win a fight, and they became essential. And of course, as many people know, we had the atomic bombing of Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which of course could only have been done from the Air Force, with some help from the Navy, of course. And with all this explosion of tactics, explosion of technology, both from World War I and World War II. Say World War I is more of the technological side. We're actually getting the planes that we want to use for many, many years. We're solidifying how we're going to use them in the sky. World War II was more so, how can we best use this to do what we want, to enact our warfare, whether that be strategic bombing or naval aviation, that sort of thing. We lead into the Cold War, which in and of itself had a lot of aviation technological improvements. We had Korea being the first site of the jet fighter. All of our Top Gun fans are just squirming in their seats now as the jet, we're first using Korea, but also Korea saw the last use of official propeller-powered fighters. After Korea, in a declared war, propeller fighters would not be used on a significant scale. Technologies such as radars and satellites, while being advanced during World War II and getting advanced, were truly solidifying into a make or break sort of technology. Radar and communications and intelligence was at the center point of the Cold War, and so aviation aided that in espionage and transporting, and paratroopers as well. As I forgot to mention, World War II, paratroopers were also used significantly in the Cold War as well. And one last thing, one important thing before we end off this segment, is the invention of the helicopter, or later known, or I guess in Vietnam, known as the air cavalry. Now, although helicopters are technically part of the army, they do obviously have a lot of their roots in air warfare, being that they are in the sky. They would collaborate with troops on the ground. They could cover vast areas of close quarters combat and close air support like no plane could. And of course, it's an even better use of transporting troops, as you don't need a large runway or a large open plane to land. You just need a couple meters of flat terrain and you're pretty much set. And that's most of the important technology. I know I grazed over a lot of technology that came into its own, but in terms of the keynotes, that is essential to what we need to know for aerial warfare in terms of the technology and the tactics. Now, there's a couple of key moments that I alluded to in the first segment that I'd like to get to, which will be in our segment 2. So, going about a little bit of the history, a little bit of the battles that actually took place. Balloon warfare. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Interesting, isn't it? Using big balloons to fly over these large swaths of land and drop bombs on innocent, I guess not innocent, but unknowing passerbys. Balloons were used, as I mentioned, extensively during the American Civil War. As I mentioned, the Union were the primary users, as they had the industrial capabilities to actually manufacture and arm these balloons, but the Confederacy did use some of itself. The Confederacy mostly used them for scouting, reconnaissance, that sort of thing. The Union mostly used them for bombing and for more offensive purposes. There's not much to say about balloons, except that, well, the Civil War actually invented the first Union Army Balloon Corps, essentially a Army Corps specifically designed for balloon combat. Now, I mentioned that technology in World War I specifically was very outdated. It's safe to say planes were quite awful at the beginning. They could barely get off the ground. You had to have 11 people just to push them to get into the air. And there was no radar. There was no way to tell bad weather. So if you had bad weather, you had to land. If you didn't know where you're going, there's actually common stories of World War I pilots landing in the middle of fields, going up to farmers and asking where the heck they were. Now, this would later change with the invention of radar and, of course, with stronger and more robust orders in order to keep men organized and on track. There was some bombing during the Franco-Prussian War and the Italo-Turkish War and the First Balkan War, but as I mentioned, the real beginning of strategic intense bombing was in World War I with the Zeppelin. Zeppelin raids became very frequent on London and was used to scare them into submission. London had a fairly strong resistance against the Germans. They resided underground, they stayed safe, they had to ration food and clothes and that sort of thing. And although this had the intended effect of trying to scare the British into submission, into getting out of this war, it only served the opposite effect, which was to further their determination to defeat Germany and rewrite Europe in their own way with their allies. Now, although Zeppelin raids were quite damning, quite powerful, and pretty effective, eventually the Zeppelin's raid had come to an end with the invention of more powerful, more accurate, and more effective British planes. The Zeppelins became a sitting duck in the sky, which allowed the Germans to then follow suit with their own planes. Now, pilots in war, they had a very unique position. You think of war, it's a very gruesome, very bloody, and very hateful environment. You're sitting in trenches with your brothers in arms, and you're sad, you're hungry, you're cold, you're hurt. And you have these old suits, these men with big mustaches and beards, decades your age, yelling orders at you to go over the top, to shoot down your fellow man. But pilots had honor. They had distinction. They had fame, really. A lot of pilots were considered basically like movie stars. They were out for chivalry. Pilots would commonly be gentle and even merciful to their other pilots. If a pilot ran out of ammo, they would allow them to escape to refuel. If they were fighting a battle they didn't think would pan out particularly well for either of them, they would retreat. They would give each other nods and waves, and this honor and this chivalry remained for a few years. But as the war dragged on and the fighting got more brutal and brutal, there's accounts of pilots really sinking into that cruelty and brutality. There was a quote, or I guess a memoir, from a French pilot who was behind a German plane, and as he was gunning down the German plane, blood from the pilot would spew back into the Frenchman's windshield and also his face. He said that he tasted the blood and it tasted like victory, and that he would want more. He wanted revenge. War had changed at this point. As we mentioned in our last two episodes, this was total war. This wasn't the chivalrous war of the American Civil War or the medieval war where knights had honor and they had codes and they stood up for what was right. Even if some of that is still a bit of a fantasy, there was still some truth to that. There was honor in war, but at this point, war had become nothing more but a bloody bloodshed of death, misery, and destruction. Now, after the pilots had given up their planes, after the war had ended, and we entered the interwar period, the planes hadn't exactly advanced too much in the interwar period. But as I mentioned, during World War I, the advancement was astonishing. From 1914 to 1918, it was not like any other theater of war I could really think of. The Army had thousands of years to develop. The Navy has had hundreds of years to develop. The Air Force had not even a full decade, really. And yet it became one of the most important theaters of war. Now, heading into World War II, one of the other most important wars for aerial warfare, of course, I have to mention again, the Battle for Britain. Battle of Britain, whatever you call it, it is an incredibly important battle. And it essentially, like Tyler said last episode, where the Battle of Midway is probably one of the most influential naval battles, if not battles of all time. I would say my pick for aerial warfare would be the Battle for Britain. There's no other just air-focused combat or fight that really speaks to me as being so integral to World War II. I mean, Britain at this point, they were lost. The French had just capitulated. Their allies were few and far between. The US was sending them weapons, but they didn't have what they needed, which was more people in the fight. Germany at this point was a powerhouse, an industrial monster that could produce around the clock significantly more than the British. Now, you've heard the speech before. I don't need to say it again, but blood, the sweat, tears, we'll fight on the beaches, we'll fight on the landing grounds. It's an iconic speech, and it is due in part to the Battle of Britain. That's sort of what was the intended result. We want to use every last bit of our resolve to win this fight. And outnumbered, outgunned, outmoraled, and out-equipped, the British, they flew around the clock, day and night, through rainy skies, through sunny skies, through the blistering cold that is up there, as it is very cold up there. They fought back the Germans, and the Germans were not able to stage an assault on Britain, and Britain stayed in the war. In doing so, this later allowed the United States to come in and the rest of her allies in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa. And the RAF was at this point also developing their radar tech, as well as the Germans, but they were really fine-tuning the communication of air warfare. The radio was solidified as a necessary and essential part, and other things like satellites were in their infancy, especially in Germany. Speaking of Germany, although it's not quite aerial warfare, some small things I wanted to touch on was, of course, the rockets and the space developments that the Germans were making. As we know, I believe it's the V2 rocket. I believe so. That was one of the rockets being developed by Germany as a way of a aerial assault on a city or really anywhere. Much more effective and much crueler than the planes that would have to fly over and put pilots at risk. This would make them relatively safe. And that's essentially all for the major developments of aerial warfare as we enter in our final segment. So, I'll do a little recap before we end off today's episode. As I mentioned, huge leap in aerial warfare. We went from biplanes in the beginning of World War II that could barely get off the ground, to later the fighters that we would use in World War II. And in just 30 years, from the end or the beginning of World War II to the 60s, we had people just barely getting into the skies to a man on the moon. Just think about that. The first voyage of the Wright brothers was in the 1910s. 50 years later, we're on the moon. The explosion of technology that needed to happen in order for that to transpire is quite amazing. Now, I know space isn't technically aerial warfare, but it's pretty close. And it really goes to show that humanity, given all their wisdom and all their intelligence and all their undying art and their want for chivalry and honor, they will always find new ways to kill each other. And as the changing tide for air warfare changed from World War I to World War II, and now from World War II to man on the moon, and now to modern era where we have jets and helicopters in the Middle East and in China and in India with all these modern conflicts, just goes to show that what new theater will be developed? I mean, just think about it. Just 100 years ago, we were barely getting planes off this ground and into the sky. Who knows what's next? And that is today's episode. And remember, throughout history, humans have always had one thing in common. We always want to kill each other. We'll see you next week.